who's here as a visitor just till next week. He comes from La Trobe University, and for those of you that don't know him, he's a Renaissance person. He brings in music, he brings in linguistics. He's worked a lot on Australian languages. He's got, we hope, a forthcoming book, The Songs of Victoria, but he also works in India, and we have many copies, how do I get it? Of this book, Turong, which you're very welcome to get from the Codor office. And who better than someone who's a musician and a linguist to talk to us about tone?
Well, thank you. And it's really nice to be in a room with people, and as well to see so many friends and colleagues online. So I've actually come up to Canberra for 3 reasons. So the first one was to interact with my colleagues here at the Australian National University, and I've been doing that and enjoying that enormously. The second of my aims was to work through some papers of Robert Hamilton Matthews, who wrote about Australian Aboriginal languages in the years 1890 to 1910 at the National Library, and making great progress on that. And the third aim, for those of you who work at the ANU, was to work out how the Coombs building works. And I have yet to make full progress on that one. Unfortunately, one of the 3 hexagons is closed at the moment, so the task is not going to be achievable. But anyway, to get back to our first point, what I might do is to share the screen and share the sound. And hopefully those of you who are at home can see this, and I'm also going to remove the presenter view, because we have yet to work out a way by which you can have the full screen view both to those watching on Zoom and those watching here in the room at the same time. And I'm also going to switch off the floating meeting controls so that we are not disturbed by them here in the room. What this means is that I can't tell whether I am muted or not, and when we come to play sound, I have to be muted on Zoom, otherwise those of you listening at home get it twice with a nice little time lag between. So Rosie and I, we've tested this out this morning, but we may make a mistake. Those of you who are watching from home, if you are hearing the sound twice, say something and we'll play it again. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about tones, about lexical tones, and these are in languages where the tone is at the level of the syllable. So I'm not talking about languages where you have what's called word tone, where you might have multiple syllables and the tone does something to the whole word. Just talking about languages that have syllables. Tones are categories, they're, if you like, phonological categories, and they have different features. And the key features might be ones which native speakers recognise, but outsiders might not. And I was going to play these 2 examples from the Cholim variety of Tangsa, but there isn't time to do them. But essentially, the most typical form of tone 1 is basically high level with glottal constriction at the end. The most typical form of tone 2 is essentially a mid-falling tone, with modal phonation, no glottal constriction. But what happens when you get a word which is level, more or less in the middle, and does not have glottal constriction? Is that tone 1 or is that tone 2? So I played this to a group of linguists a few years ago at a different university, and they all said it's tone 1 because they were hearing for the level feature of tone 1 as being the crucial one, and the fact that tone 2 is typically falling. But for the speakers, it's the phonation, it's the glottalization of tone 1 that is the crucial feature, and since this word didn't have that, it has to be tone 2. So tones may be a bundle of features, many of you already know this. Pitch, relative pitch of course, because the pitch of men with very low voices is always going to, their high tone is always going to be lower than the low tone of people who have high voices, so it's always relative pitch. And if I forget to put relative in brackets, you have to remember that when we say pitch, we mean relative pitch. Contour, which is rising, falling, or both. or a combination of them. Phonation, glottalization, creakiness, breathiness, modal phonation. Duration, this one doesn't get talked about as much, but I will mention it, and intensity. So simply describing tones as combinations of H and L isn't going to always be enough. And this is one of the fun aspects of language, of course. The features which are crucial for distinguishing tones may change over time. And what we can see in some of these languages is that it looks like phonation was long ago more crucial to distinguish tone categories than it has become. And the final point that makes tones really fun is that the functional load differs from language to language. So here I'll just simply say that the first language that I studied, the Tai Pake, there they have 6 tones, and it is counterintuitive, but working on a language with 6 tones can be easier than working on a language with 2. Because a language with 6 tones, you have to get the distinctions right all the time, otherwise you haven't a clue what's going on. The functional load is really high. But as the number of tones decreases, the functional load can also decrease. And if the functional load is low, then it's harder to distinguish them. Okay, a very quick piece of further introduction is to do with the ways of notating tones. Now, I'm not going to talk about this in great detail, except that the first 3 are more or less giving you some information about the phonetics of the tone, in this case, mostly to do with the relative pitch and contour, whereas the last type of tone marking, arbitrarily assigned symbols, simply indicates that this is category number 1, and we have to know from some other sources what that means. So, for example, I've got there AX and AZ. These are tone categories used in some of the Romanizations for Tangsa languages in northeast India, but if I don't tell you what X and Z mean, you won't know. But the speakers learn, when somebody learns to read this language, they get told this is how X sounds, this is how Z sounds. There is nothing remotely phonic, there's nothing remotely phonemic about those. They're purely arbitrary. And that's what is on this next slide, is more or less what I just said. So people in this part of the world will use all of these different systems. And one of the things that's a bit tricky is to work out which system it is. In particular, some people, well, this is what I do, will often use superscripted numbers to indicate the tone category, but they then look a little bit like the superscripted numbers in the Dalle system, where 1-1 means a low tone. And of course, just to add a little bit of fun to this, in Mesoamerica, 1-1 means the highest tone, and 4-4 means the lowest tone. But in Asia, they count up to 5, etc. So there are some interesting issues. You just have to work out what's going on. Okay, so the notation of tones, I asked the question, what do native writing systems do? And I looked at a few in the general Asian area. So Bangkok Thai, which has been writing tones pretty much certainly for around 800 years, give or take. The tone markers in Bangkok Thai mark the proto-tone categories that were in place 800 years ago, which have split in very interesting and diverse ways, and that would be a whole other lecture. And they've split over the time since they were applied, and for example, the tone mark that anybody who knows Thai language would know, mai ek, which is just like a little number 1, means different things depending on the initial consonant because of tone splits that I have not enough time to explain. So it's not even remotely phonic. These are historical phonological categories. Amongst the Paho Hmong, they have come up with a system. And what you'll see in this chart, and I don't really know very much about this, but it is a native orthography, the Roman letters across the top are the 7 tone categories, but you will see that the way in which these are realised with different letters, with different vowels, is very variant, right? So you've got 2 series of initial consonants, and then you've got the tone marks all over the place. So I won't begin to explain that system. But I will spend a moment talking about the system of I shouldn't have said here the system of tones, I should have said the writing system created by the late Lacombe Mosang, who died just under a year ago, last July, just at the point that after 30 years of promoting this script, people were finally taking it up. A very creative person, you'll hear his voice in a moment. He was, as creative people sometimes are, a tiny bit challenging to work with. And let's say that he had created a system where he was teaching this script by hand. He numbered these, gives numbers to these, as you'll hear in a minute, and some slight modifications to the script were desired by everybody else, and we really had to work with him closely on that. But I think by the time he died, he was aware that there was action. But unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to see the script included in Unicode, which happened this January. And that's a pity, because it's actually a very interesting script in that the symbols that he has created combine symbols for vowels and symbols for tones in an arbitrary manner, as you can see here. So in the first line, on this table here, I've written his script on the top line. In the middle is the usual romanization that the community he comes from uses, where Z is a low tone, C is a high tone, sometimes rising, and X is what they call the middle tone, but it's sort of more high falling. And you can see, and I've kind of tried to indicate, and Q means final glottal stop, which they regard as one of the tones. And what you can see from this is that the symbol for the four different, the symbols for the four different O and the four different R really have no relationship to each other. I mean, there's a little bit. You could say, well, maybe there's a vertical line with R, and then the short up, which I've here indicated with the glottal stop, is a derived symbol, but that was done not by the founder of the script, but by the Tangsa Script Development Committee. And yes, you could say that the two first E symbols, E the low one and E the high one, are sort of related to each other, but then E and E, the last two, are not. Okay, as we'll see, Tangsa languages typically have 3 tones on open syllables and a stop final one that's regarded as a 4th tone, and that's what he's created. The really interesting thing about this script is you can't write it without tones. Now, what is going to happen now? So, the low tone, as I've indicated, shown with the grave accent Z in the Reverend Garm-Wynn's orthography, the high tone with a C, the final glottal stop shown with a Q in the Romanized orthography, and the mid to high falling tone with an X. Now, here we're going to play the first recording, and the first thing I have to do is mute. Is it done? No?
One O, 2 O, 3 O, 4 O, 5 R, 6 R, 7 R, 8 R.
Okay, so I hope everybody at home was able to hear that. I should have mentioned before playing it that he introduces each of his sounds by saying 1 or 2 or 3 or, etc. like that, and that's the way he taught the script. So you get an idea then of the 4-tone system. All right, so the message so far is that and I should also say that all of the Roman-based orthographies that have been developed for tonal languages in this area mark the tone categories by these arbitrary systems. So nobody's attempting to mark tone categories by saying high, low, and so on. Yes, they are using an arbitrary symbol. And all the native speakers who've developed tone marking systems for the languages have analysed them as having 4 tones, 3 on open syllables, and a stop, glottal stop, and other stops, final tone. And this analysis has been confirmed by modern linguistic work. So the only one who did this work before community members, in fact, yes, just before Lacombe Mosang came up with his script, was the late Alphonse Weidert. But all of these other studies have been subsequent to that, and they sort of confirm each other. So remember, 3 tones and 1 with glottal finals. So that's... Now I need to introduce where the languages I'm talking about are. So this is the linguistic map of Naga languages. For those of you who can't quite work out where in the world this is, we have the Brahmaputra Valley of northeast India at the top, and the big river down the bottom is the Chindwin, which runs from north to south in the northwest part of Burma. And running through the middle of the map, starting, if we start on the top right-hand corner at the letter A of Tangsa, there is a big, thick, dotted black line, and that's the India-Burma border. The other big, thick, dotted black line a bit to the left of it is the border of the state of Assam and the state of Arunachal Pradesh and then Nagaland. So these are the languages that are called Naga. Now, as it turns out, the languages at the top, those in orange and red, the Konyak, well, the ones that are here called Konyak and Konyak Kamnyan, these are a linguistic subgroup. They are also more closely related to languages not shown on this map than they are to the rest of the languages shown on this map. So while culturally there are significant similarities between this group, linguistically there aren't. And the languages that are on the sort of bottom half of the map, those in yellow, green, purple, and that sort of pinky, orangey colour with Tangkul, they do not form a subgroup. So, and the ones that I'm talking about are the Tangsa languages, which are right at the top, on the top right-hand corner, and they're split between Burma, Myanmar, and India. Neither Burma nor India are places one can easily go for field work right now, but thanks to the miracles of Zoom, one can actually get information about some of these varieties. So the languages which are called Tangsa or Tangshang, or Tangshang Naga or Tangsa Naga, are on both sides. There's around 80, that's 80, what we call sub-tribes. There's also clan systems that run across this. The sub-tribes each have a unique linguistic variety. Some are almost identical and mutually intelligible with each other. Some are so unintelligible with each other that you couldn't possibly understand them, and there is most certainly nobody alive today or ever in history who would be able to understand all of them. But there's some people who understand an impressive proportion of them, and the term Tangsa in India and Tangshang in Myanmar are not cognate with each other. Both are relatively newly coined. The dates are given there. Officially, the ISO calls it Naga Tasse, and Tasse is the pronunciation of Tangsa in 2 varieties. This pronunciation got privileged because they were the varieties where the Bible translation was first happening. But there are also 3 other codes, NJB, NNP, and another one, which I think is TVT, which on the Burma side are subsumed under NST, but on the India side are different. So for those of you who are interested in IS codes and the challenges that they present, this is a good case. There has been some desire to split them to the point of mutual intelligibility, but I think we should wait until we know what's actually going on before we do that. Finally, each group has an autonym. So, for example, the Mashang call themselves Mashang. Other people, there's a general name, and we don't know actually whose that is, which is Mosang. The Cholim call them Myohang. Now, those don't seem very different, but the general name for the Cholim is Tonglum, which, well, okay, but the Cholim call themselves Cholim, the Mashang call them Tulum, etc. So it is, the naming of these groups is complex. Where are they? So this is a map that Kellen Van Dam, who's my former PhD student, produced, and this shows the Batgai ranges between the town of Margarita in the north and Kumti in the south. They're both on exactly the same longitude. and all these villages are exactly between us. So it's a really nice, clear north-south. And the villages, varieties we'll talk about today, so I've already mentioned the Mashao. I did briefly mention the Tulim, but I really want to talk today about the Ngaimong and about the Lotang, who for some reason didn't make it onto this map, but they're there. And if we look at the British map from 1934, what you'll see is that all of these their villages are settled on the tops of mountain ridges. Very steep ones in many cases. So the Mashao are off this map, but the Cholim, here written as Tulim, are on the bottom. The two I'm mainly going to be talking about, the Ngaimong, they are written Maimong, and the Lotang, they are written Langxing, because those names are the more general names, are sort of within walking distance of each other, but it would probably take, that's probably about 10 or 12 kilometres, maybe 15 as the crow flies, but you'd have to be a crow because there's several river valleys in between that are quite demanding to get across. Okay, so and a few photos, 3 Ngaimong elders and the Lotang Sapolo group. I just mentioned the Sapolo because the Mole festival where this is traditionally performed has been going on in the last week. And one of the Tangsa people in northeast India has made some really very impressive recordings of this, which I am going to talk to Julia later about possibly getting archived, because we're now moving to the point where community are doing this by themselves. Okay, so one of the first things that I tried to do was to compare the tone systems of the different varieties, and using the Zhao numerals to indicate what the pitch was and indeed what the phonation was, where we had information about that, of all these different varieties. So if we look, for example, take a look at the Rinku language at the bottom. Tone 1 is marked 5/5 glottal, that's high. Tone 2, 3/3. Tone 1, 2/1. So that's high, mid, and low. If you then compare this with the Chang-Chang, for example, Chang-Chang tone 1 is low, tone 2 is mid, and tone 3 is high and falling, so they call those low, mid, and high. So when you compare, and the point I need to make here is that the group of words that have tone 1, are all cognate with each other. Okay, and the group of words that have tone 2, with very few minor exceptions, are cognate with each other. So the realisation of these tones is different from one variety to the next. Now, we're going to listen to the tones in, and this is going to involve some muting in a second, to the tones in Ngaimong. You will hear him pronounce the words for stamping, or he uses a different word. I forgot what it is, but you'll hear it in a minute. 3 times, and then he's going to pronounce ear, and then he's going to pronounce paddy field, but I want you to listen carefully to the word for paddy field, which, as you will agree, is, if anything, a slight rise at the beginning, but then level. So if we can mute.
Ngaimong word 3 times. So to trample means
na, na, na,
ear,
na, na, na,
and a rice paddy field.
na, na, na.
Okay.
So the second tone is higher than the third tone, but more or less level. Okay, so, whoops. And here's some pitch charts showing the pitch traces for these 3 tones. I won't play this recording because that's too much trouble, but you can, these are now arranged in the order 1, 2, 3. You can see that the first one is falling. You can see that the second one has this little rise and then is level, and you can see that the third one is level and lower. The third one is also a bit longer, and the longer is a reflex of the fact that the phonation category of the third tone was breathy, and that made it longer. But that is no longer recognised here. So this is Kellen Van Damme's description of it, and he adds long as being one of the crucial features of tone 3, creaky as tone 2, as tone 1, but you will see that tone 2 is described as level. So if that's the case, what about this group of words?
Lapong,
Sen,
Pang, Pang, Pang,
hill, anthill,
Pipuilom, Pipuilom, Pipuilom,
dust,
Lapong, Lapong, Lapong,
sand,
Pang, Pang, Pang,
hill, anthill,
Pipuilom, Pipuilom, Pipuilom.
Now, when I first heard this, I thought, well, surely the last syllables of all of these words, which is a single syllable in the middle case, that these are actually falling tones and somewhat high. Lapong, Pipuilom. What is going on? So I did what we can now do, which is to put them into bracket. And sure enough, you can see, this is the word Pipuilom, meaning an anthill. You can see very clearly that the first tone, because that's the blue line, the one that is talking about the pitch, the first tone is lower than the other two. Not an enormous amount, but it is. And often when you have multi-syllables, the first and second syllable are not realised quite as fully as the last one. You can see that the second syllable, which is a tone 2, is indeed level, but that the last syllable clearly has falling. Okay, we can see it and we can hear it. So I discussed this with, and you also need to know at this point that what I did with Wang Kui Ngaimong, who was the consultant here, is we first agreed, we listened to those 3 words on na, which was the trampling or stamping word, that's a verb, the word for a paddy field and the word for ear, and I asked him for every single word, for every single syllable of every single word, which one is it? And he would say, oh, that's like the ear, that's like the paddy field, that is stamping, right? So I haven't assigned the tone categories here, he did. This is, I think, important, because most of us as linguists would be tempted to assign 2 different tone categories here for the last 2 syllables. So you will notice that the last syllable is longer, and that's because syllables tend to, in multisyllabic words, syllables tend to be realised longer, more fully in the last syllable. And indeed, sometimes people will say, when you have a multisyllabic word, the first 2 syllables are not carrying tone. But Wang Kui was happy to assign tones to all of them. So I asked him about it. And I made a note in December 2014. The falling tone at the end was explained by Wang Kui as because of repetition. When he pronounced the word on the 14th of December 2014, it was with a level final. Now, I looked for this recording because I wanted to show this to you, of course. I wouldn't have written that if it wasn't true, but it did not emerge from the many tens of thousands of recordings that I have. So maybe I didn't record it, which is unfortunate. But remember that Kellen, who also worked with Wang Kui very intensively, regarded this as a level tone. Later, he came to refer to the falling tone, alternative of the second tone, as the potar paddy field falling. So he would say, that's a potar falling. And this was this ridiculous conversation we would have, because paddy fields do not tend to fall. It's not something they do, but he was using the word potar in this linguistic way to refer to the tone category. So the falling rice field or the falling paddy field. So key take-home message here is that this difference between the level second tone and the falling realisation of the second tone isn't phonemic. It's a variation that only seems to occur in final position. But in closely related varieties, there might be a phonemic distinction between 2 tones that have exactly that form. it appears that what matters with the second tone is where it starts, and the fact that it's mid-level for the first part of its existence, and if we go back to this chart, it's actually level for the whole of the vowel, and maybe that's what's crucial here. I was going to play this minimal pair, but I don't think I'll go. Just to remind you what Kelvin Van Dam wrote about it, it's phonemically high and level. So what he's saying there is, phonemically high and level aims to capture the underlying form. It doesn't speak about the phonetic realizations, which clearly include falling. Now, Ngaimong provides us with another nice example that challenges the issue of tone. So remember, the Ngaimong had three basic tones. It had a low falling tone, it had a mid-level tone, sort of a lowish level tone, number 3, and it had this higher level tone, number 4, which has a falling realization in final position. But now I'm going to play you 3 words which carry, well, the first 2 carry tone 1, and the 4th one carries a final glottal stop. But before I play that, I'm going to play again the 3 basic tones. And since I'm not going to be able to talk to those of you who are out of the room in between playing all these recordings, what you'll hear with the 3 level tones, I think, is tones 1, 2, and 3. And then you will hear the examples of these 3 words being prefixed. Okay, so let's mute.
Na, na. Pal, apal. Va, iva. Pai, apai.
So I hope that everybody agrees that the pitch of those pairs is not the same. That the group on the right, pal, ipal. He said apal, but you can also say ipal. I've transcribed the wrong thing there. Va, alva, that there is clearly a pitch difference between them. Now, immediately we would think, well, this is a different tone category. And in some of the Tangsa languages, as you'll see shortly, tone categories do switch when you put a nominalizing prefix on them. And when Wangkui Ngaimong first talked to me, he said, we have an extra tone in Ngaimong. We have this one, and demonstrated. But what we found with this, and here's a pitch chart of whole, which is, for those of you who know your Bible, you will know that this is the word for vomit. And in fact, ipal can literally mean it's vomit. So this is why I put that there. But you can see very clearly from this pitch chart that the prefixed version is somewhat, considerably higher. But unlike the high falling tone variant of tone 2, which may or may not occur as a variant of the final syllable, the high falling tone variant of tone 1 and the stopped tone is entirely predictable. It's if you have a prefix, you have a high falling version of it. Always. So do we need to mark this as a different tone category? So in terms of phonemics, no, because you just say, you prefix it, it goes up. And eventually the community decided to do that too, which is interesting because it's an indication of how people feel about it. Remembering that Ngaimong underlyingly has 2 level tones and 1 falling tone, which is low falling but becomes high falling when prefixed. But I played these recordings via Facebook during this week to Wanglung Mosang, who speaks a different variety where there are 2 falling tones, a low falling tone and a high falling tone. And I thought, and asked him, how would you write these? And I thought he might answer, you write the first one with the low falling tone and you write the second one with the high falling tone. But he didn't. He said he'd write them both with the high falling tone, which is X in his system, adding that it's because of the initial V, the speaker makes an extra effort to pronounce it. So But here, what might be happening is that he is already a speaker of a related language, and he knows that there is not variation in the tone between the two forms of this verb in his variety, so he's kind of adjusting himself, even though he can hear them being differently. So there's something else to discover about that. This leads me to a brief digression about stem alternation. And because time is running out, because I've prepared too much material and talked too much, I'll have to be brief about this, but essentially in these languages, for many verbs, there is what we call the verbal form, which combines with an agreement marker. So we have here hot door. This is in the Chum Chung variety. That means they, she, it wept, versus a haw, which means, or a haw, which means weeping. And the tone category is different. It changes from hot to haw. And this is what we call stem alternation. And it turns out that I made a study of stem alternation in Naimong and Mashao, two varieties I've already mentioned about. 63% of the verbs had no alternate stem, but 22.5% of them showed cognate changes. So they changed from a particular tone category to the same different tone category. Basically, that's how it was done. And 10.6% of them did something different. So we're now going to talk about so one of the things we first thought, and indeed the article that I wrote about tone stem alternation said this is what might be happening here, but we've decided not. So in Lo Tang variety, here we have three tones, and this is what Kellen wrote about them. Tone 1 is mid-low falling, second tone is the emphatic falling modal voice, and third tone is mid-level. Please remember, no rising tone mentioned here. But I'm going to talk about the stem alternation first. So in Lo Tang, the verbs which are shown, so I've given you the verbal form in the middle column and the nominal form on the right-hand side, and that Q in the word for weep there, of course, that's a hangover of orthography. Should have been turned into a glottal stop. Thought I'd done that, but anyway. And what you'll see is that when you prefix them with E or I to make them nominal, sometimes the tone category changes. That's what you see in yellow. Sometimes it doesn't. And it's not related to what the tone category of the original verb is, because we can see that the verb for go has tone category 1 but does not change. The verb for fly does not change, but the verbs for come and go up, ascend, have tone category 1 and do change. So how this can be accounted for. And just to make life more fun, for these apparently closely related varieties, the stem alternations don't work in the same way. So we can see with the verb go that the verbal form has the same tone category across all of them, and incidentally has the vowel change from R to the historical vowel would have been R, the change from R to A in Cholim and E in Chum Chung and Lo Tang. These are entirely predictable, but you can see that the alternate stem versions are very diverse and not always changing to the same tone category. In the case of the verb for come, yes, they all change, but those of you with very keen eyesight will see that they change to tone category 3 everywhere except in Lo Tang, where it changes to tone category 2. There may be a reason for that. If one of the Tangsa varieties is going to do something eccentric, it will be Lo Tang. While we might be able to reconstruct the presence of stem alternation to a proto-stage, even proto-Tangsa, for which around 1400 is now being suggested, for other reasons that I haven't time to go into, we can't reconstruct the form of it. So I can't really spend time to this, but one possible way of analysing stem alternation, why one group of verbs do it and the others don't, is that there are actually underlying two different groups of verbs. One which causes a tone change and the other which doesn't. Now, if you really want to follow this idea up, the wonderful book by Alexis Michaud, Tone in Yongning Na, is the place to go. This is several hundred pages of really interesting data, a language where you have 4 tones, 3, I think, in citation form for words, but the underlying tone categories have to be more. And my PhD student, Li Bulahi, also known as Li Jianfu or Jianfu Li or Zachary or various other names. I seem to have PhD students with multiple names. It's a real pleasure working in our department. He found the same thing in his own language, Namushi Kato, that you would have 2 verbs, sets of verbs, but I can remember one pair of verbs which at citation level are exactly the same, but when you add tense aspect markers to them, the tones of the tense aspect markers are different for one verb than from the other. And this is explainable by some sort of underlying tonal distinction. Okay, I'm going to skip over, I think, because I am running out of time, the agreement markers, because I do want to say something about the situation of the moon. So, and exactly how this happens and why this happens, we have at the moment no idea. But the word for moon in many Tangsa varieties is a 2-syllable word, and in many of them that we've been able to really get reliable information from, the first syllable is tone 3 and the second is tone 2. Now what I've put up here is the table of words from Bin Kam Lan's 2017 thesis about Shetieu and Mungre. And Bin Kam Lan is a native speaker of both because his father is a Mungre and his mother is a Shetieu, and Shetieu is also the lingua franca of the area where he grew up. So he knows them both, and he knows that the tones are realised differently in those 2 varieties, and he certainly has notated those words where the tone categories don't match. But what we've got in this table is a phonetic transcription using the Zhao numerals under the phonetic and a phonemic transcription using these category numbers under phonemic. And what you'll see for the word for moon number, reference 1318, count 1753, I don't know why those numbers are there. I think the reference is to a word list he was working off, and I think he got a few more words than the word list consisted of, but can't remember. You will see that the word for moon in both Shetieu and in Mungre has a 3rd tone followed by a 2nd tone. Now, in the Lochang variety, remember that tone 2 was described by Van Damme as emphatic falling. So we should expect to hear a word with the 2nd tone being emphatically falling. Now, if you can silence. The word for moon, how do you say?
Yipu, yipu, yipu.
So the first of these Yi, this is
Yi, it's like a
bao.
bao.
Yeah.
Wu is a little bit changed.
Little bit changed.
Yeah.
Now, what does that word sound like in Mungre?
Yepi, yepi, yepi.
Okay, and what is the word for grandfather in Mungre?
Achi,
And this is B,
yepi. Yeah.
same as
the
grandfather.
same. Yeah, the same.
But in
Lochang,
Lochang it's
it
different.
changed. Yeah.
So the reason why I wanted to play the discussion that I had with Daniel, and in Daniel Moyo, who is speaking that, and in his case, his mother is Lochang and his father is Mungre, so he knows those 2 varieties, is that he recognised that there was something unusual about the tone of the 2nd syllable of moon in Lochang, but not in Mungre. And when he was talking about it, I should have explained this in advance, that he uses the word snake, and that's referring to the tone of the 1st syllable, because tone 3, the typical word, is snake. So what you could hear, I think, quite clearly there is that the 2nd syllable of the word for moon, and I've put the pitch traces here, and I've highlighted for the first one, the second syllable is clearly rising. Now remember, there are no rising tones in Lotang. But the second syllable here is clearly rising. So during the month of February, we've had some discussions over Facebook, which have been interrupted from time to time by the presence in Myanmar not only of the COVID-19 virus, but also of the military coup on the 1st of February. But from time to time, we can talk to each other. And Daniel has come up with a list of words: moon, pestle, deer, earring, sugarcane. Must be one more in there, which he feels have this special tone. And Kamlam, who is distantly related, I think, but who speaks two different varieties, but is the person who is promoting the use of the orthography, has said it sounds like they have a V tone. But he's marked it on the first syllable. This is what he suggested for these words. And then Daniel responded and said, no, 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 this must be marked on the second syllable. Now, what is happening here? Are we possibly looking at the creation of a new tone category? And why would this group of words, relatively small group of words, have this separate category? Okay, so my conclusion, which has then come far too late. So tones in Tangsa employ a bundle of features and are not realised only by relative pitch and contour, but also by phonation and in some cases duration. There are different phonetic realisations, might sometimes be phonemic distinctions between two tones in one variety, but some kind of variation of the same tone in another. As with the variation of tone 2 in Ngaimong in final position and the variation of tone 1 in Ngaimong when it is prefixed, because there are certainly other varieties where that difference, the pul and a pul, as we heard before, would sound as a phonemic distinction. In some varieties, there may be evidence for a fourth open tone, either at the level of the realisation of the tones. So in the case of the final syllable for moon in Lotang, and we just really don't know what's going on there, but at this stage, when creating a writing system for it, the community's desire is to write it because they can't explain this difference in any other way. The variation we saw of the others can be explained, but this can't. Or at the underlying level, which is a possible explanation for the variation of the stem alternation. And finally, tone categories change according to a range of linguistic factors. So, for example, all the Tangsa languages have this stem alternation for at least some verbs, and we saw examples of this before, where in Lotang the verb meaning sleep is gone on a whatever tone 1 is in Lotang, I've forgotten, but when prefixed with it becomes ikon, which is a high falling tone. And I didn't have a chance to talk to you about the other aspect of that, but so you can have the category of the tone change according to, for grammatical reasons, but not for all of the verbs. So I think that's probably a good point to stop. Should we
Yes, if you want to unshare your screen. Thanks for a fascinating talk. We've got about 9 or so minutes for questions, so we'll alternate between questions from those who are on Zoom and those who are in the room here. So I'll just pop back and keep tabs on the chat, and you can turn your microphone on to ask your question if you want from Zoom.
Thank you. I hope it was more or less clear.
No questions in the chat.
Are there no questions in the chat? No. Do you want to come up and ask the questions so those on?
Okay, it's really wonderful. I'm just wondering whether there's any phonetic iconicity to the variant. Like when you go from mid-low to high-low, is there anything in the prefix or anything in the historic morphology that makes it change in that direction rather than in another direction?
Right. The difficulty I have there is that I was trying to stop the sound from coming, because I'm hearing everything twice.
All right, maybe.
Yes. Yeah, I think yeah.
Okay, yeah, so I'll go again. The question is whether there's iconicity in, I think there's echo. Yeah. Are we good now?
Go ahead.
What's the question now?
So it was to do with iconicity.
Yes, so you talked about this change from low mid to high mid falling. And I'm wondering whether there's anything in the prefix or in the morphology that makes it change in this specific direction.
A very good question. And this does allow me to make reference to something that I didn't have time to talk about. So I will again share the screen and go back and talk about the stem alternation. The current slide. Yeah, it's just one more thing I have to do, which is this right. So it's that one that we want. Okay, so I mentioned during the discussion that with the variation with the word for come, the stem alternation variation with the word for come, it changed to category 3 in every variety except for Lo Chang, where it changed to category 2. But what I didn't mention to you is that in the varieties that I know best, or at least some of the varieties that I know best, but particularly in the varieties that are closest to Lo Chang, namely Chulim and Cham Chang, tone 3 is a high-falling tone, and tone 2 is a middle tone. Whereas in Lo Chang, it's the other way around. So at least one possible explanation of this variation is that the Lo Chang people are hearing the variation, the stem alternation, as going to high falling in their nearby varieties and making the same change there, which is a different tone category in Lo Chang. So does that then suggest that the alternate stem created by this prefixing is in fact somehow related to the idea of high falling, which is also what happens in this entirely phonemic process, in predictable process in Ngaimon, where you went from pal to a pal. So I think it's an interesting question that you ask, because I wonder if this is the case. But what I don't know is how you would prove something like that, so that perhaps at a long back historical stage of the language, what these prefixes actually did was to create this high falling version, and it's now being realized in a multitude of ways across a range of languages. So that's the best answer I can come up with, but something is happening that needs to be accounted for. We are a long way short. One of the things, of course, that we need to do is to collect this level of detailed information for all of the varieties, and we're way off that. And really, because one more variety could introduce the fact that explains it all, right? And we haven't got there yet. So, yeah, good. Does that satisfy your... Yeah, thank you.
This is a question about the writing system. So the first part of it is, what are people using the writing for? And the second part is just to go back to your the last example you showed us with the moon,
yes,
where, if I've understood it correctly, at the phonetic level you were 3-2, and at the phonemic level you were 2-3, and so they were deciding, do we put the tone letter on the first syllable or the second syllable?
Yeah. So in terms of the writing system, the, within the Tangsa community there are multiple sub-tribes, as I said before, and they all have different ways of saying things, and they have different tone systems. And for those that have already, but this one is in a sense unique, the Mashang variety, because they have a romanization that they have a Bible translated into, and they also have the script. Now there's comparatively few people using the romanized system because it's quite complicated, and it's difficult to say when people write in language whether they write in the orthography that's been nicely marked up for tone with all these final C's and X's and quite complex digraphs and even trigraphs for vowels and things, versus writing in the script. In order to get the script approved by Unicode, we had to demonstrate that it was being used. And one of the things that I think helped win over the committee was the fact that somebody was using it for writing shopping lists. And I could find that, but it would take a moment to bring it up. And he had also been writing his own name in the script on, on magazines and books. And so, but there's relatively few people doing that, but there's relatively few people using the Romanized orthography with all the tone marking. And if people write at all in their language, they're most likely to use a sort of basic romanization where they just have an approximation that's far from phonemic. So, but the other thing is that the script is not yet fully implemented in Unicode, so we really don't know where it's going, but it is being supported by people. Now the question of the moon, so I probably didn't explain that as clearly as I might have. The story there is that there really is an unexpected fourth tone category which doesn't fit in with the story. So what I should have mentioned here is that we have agreed that for the Lotang variety we will mark the tones as either unmarked for tone category number 3, which is the first syllable of the word for moon, or with an X if it's tone category number 1, and a Z if it is if it's tone category number 1, and an X if it's tone category number 2. So what they are introducing here is another tone category, the V, but they are disagreeing about where it should go. Whether it's a feature, whether it's something happening on the first syllable that is causing the second syllable to be different, which is what Kamlan was suggesting, and was hearing, incidentally, from a speaker. So when he says, I am here with a speaker, he's talking to someone in Nanyun, and Daniel is somewhere else, who is pronouncing the words in a way that suggests that it's something in the first syllable that is causing this.
Stephen, could you go back to the previous slide where you've actually got the phonemic and phonetic versions of that?
Yes, but that's not, this is not in the variety where that has this variant form. Okay, this is in 2 other varieties. Well, no, but these are phonetic realizations, and this 2-2 is a kind of low tone, and 3-3 is a higher tone, middle tone. It doesn't, because 3 is the phonemic way of writing a 2-2 tone in this variety. Whereas 3 is a phonemic, sorry, I didn't explain. 3 is a phonetic way of writing 4-2 in that variety. This is a notational problem, which is one of the reasons why I tried to explain that at the beginning, but yeah, it's tricky. I think there are many complexities in Australian languages that we all recognise, but you are perhaps feeling pleased at this point in the day that this isn't one of them.
One final question to relay from the chat.
Yes.
From Najib, is it possible to analyse the E prefix as a tone case marker?
So that the E itself is bringing tone information onto the word, which That's an interesting thought, and the problem is that I haven't gone through the many dozens of examples of words where putting an E in front of it doesn't make any difference. But you could then argue that maybe historically the E did this, had this role, that it had the role of affecting the tone of what it was attached to, but that it no longer does that to all of the words, just to some of them. That would work as an explanation, but I think again we'd probably have to look more widely. If this stem alternation, one possible explanation of how stem alternation arises is that it comes as a result of it is a sort of phonological process, and it arises from something exactly like that. That makes sense, but it no longer works consistently across varieties or across all possible nouns, across all possible verbs. I'm sorry I can't answer that more clearly. Scenario we'll have to look into further.
Draw it to a close there. Everyone has to be elsewhere or leaves the room. So if you could join me again in thanking Stephen for a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Good luck with the ongoing analysis.
Yes. Well, it was nice to spend some time thinking about it over the last week. Yeah. Thank you all. So should we finish the meeting?
I'll stop the recording.
Yeah.
Everyone else wants to keep chatting.
Yeah. So